Imagine picking up a comic book, a medium usually known for bright colors and like really simple morality tales.
Right, the classic good guys versus bad guys.
Exactly. But you open it up and discover that the ultimate world-ending supervillain trying to destroy the country is actually the sitting president of the United States.
Yeah, that is definitely not what you'd expect.
No, that is not a pitch for some edgy, modern streaming reboot. I mean, that actually happened in the 1970s, right in the pages of Captain America.
It's such a jarring image, especially for a character who is quite literally draped in the American flag. But I think it completely shatters this assumption that superhero stories are just, empty, noisy CGI spectacles.
Which is exactly our mission today for this deep dive. We are looking at a character who most people assume is just a guy running around with a vibranium frisbee.
A very expensive frisbee.
Right. But when you look at how he was brought to life in the 2011 film, specifically Captain America, the first Avenger, you realize you're actually looking at a complex mirror reflecting basically 70 years of American history.
It really is.
So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by decades of comic book lore, or, if you just think of blockbusters as mindless popcorn movies, prepare for some serious aha moments. We're going to show you how pop culture is secretly tracking our real-world societal shifts right under your nose.
And we've got a fantastic stack of sources to pull this apart today. We're working with a really fascinating new historicism academic study on the character's evolution, plus a detailed comic-to-movie comparison guide.
Oh, and that incredible interview with the film's composer, Alan Silvestri.
Yes, that too. Along with some behind-the-scenes production mechanics, and we're even looking at Roger Ebert's original film review.
So I actually want to start with the 2011 movie, because before you can saddle a character with 70 years of heavy historical baggage, you have to convince an audience to care about him as a human being first.
You really do.
And getting Chris Evans to play Steve Rogers was notoriously difficult. He turned down the role 3 separate times.
Yeah, and by his own admission, that refusal was entirely fear-based. Evans was looking at the modern blockbuster machine and, well, he was basically seeing a trap.
How so?
He was terrified of the extremes. Like, if the movie bombs, his career is severely damaged. But if it succeeds, he's locked into a massive 6-picture deal with Marvel. He genuinely felt he was signing away his anonymity and his creative freedom for the next decade of his life.
Which is incredibly ironic, if you think about it, because he was basically afraid of the exact same super soldier serum that Steve Rogers takes in the movie.
Oh, that's a great point.
Right. It's a one-way ticket. It changes your life forever, and there is no going back to who you were before.
Yeah.
But he eventually takes the leap, and the gamble paid off in a way I don't think anyone expected. Even Roger Ebert, who famously hated loud, mindless blockbusters, he actually praised this film.
Ebert's review is incredibly revealing. He specifically pointed out that unlike Thor or Green Lantern, which were, released around the same time,
and relied heavily on generic digital cityscapes.
Exactly. Unlike those, the first Avenger felt like a real movie. He loved the texture of the 1940s period setting. But what really hooked Ebert was the physical transformation. He was astounded by the seamless transition of Chris Evans from this 90-pound weakling to a muscle-bound hero.
Wait, I always wondered about this.
Yeah.
Because I assumed they just pulled a classic Hollywood trick, like cast a really skinny actor for the first act of the movie and then swap Chris Evans in after the character gets into the sci-fi machine.
That would be the easy way.
Yeah. Why go through the agonizing process of digitally shrinking Evans? Doesn't focusing so much on the physical transformation risk overshadowing the character's internal journey?
Well, actually, that was director Joe Johnston's absolute line in the sand. He argued the exact opposite. He said that if you cast a different actor for the first act, the audience connects with that actor's soul, not Evans's.
Oh, I see.
Johnston insisted the entire point of the movie wasn't to make a jingoistic flag waver. It was to prove that the person inside the body matters more than the physical strength. So Evans had to play the weak Steve with the exact same heart, the same cadence, and the same courage as the muscular Steve.
Okay, that makes total sense from an acting perspective. The physical transformation only works narratively if you implicitly trust his internal moral compass never changes.
Exactly.
But the mechanics of actually pulling that off sound like a nightmare. I was reading the breakdown of how the visual effects company, LOLA, handled this. It's basically digital plastic surgery.
It really is.
It required 4 separate takes for every single shot where Skinny Steve's was on screen.
Think about the math involved here. First, they shoot the scene normally, with the muscular Evans acting alongside his co-stars just to get the rhythm of the scene.
Right.
Second, Evans performs those exact same actions alone in front of a green screen. This is so they can mathematically reduce his body mass in a computer later.
But wait, if they shrink him, he's suddenly way shorter. How did the other actors know where to look in the first take?
That leads to the really meticulous part. To make Evans look small, they often had to put the other actors on apple boxes or elevated walkways.
You're kidding.
No, seriously. And for close-ups, they couldn't even look him in the eye. They literally painted marks on Evans's chin or chest to represent where his eyes would be after they shrunk him. So Evans was constantly looking at the top of his co-stars' heads.
That is absurd.
Yeah.
Acting is all about reacting to the eyes and they're staring at his chin.
It requires immense discipline. Then, for the third take, they shoot a clean plate. So the scene with everyone acting, but entirely without Evans, they needed a clean background to drop the newly shrunken Evans back into.
Wow.
And finally, the fourth take involved a body double. They used a theater actor named Leander Dini. He was chosen specifically because he had a similar gait and shoulder structure. They would film him mimicking Evans's actions, primarily for scenes where the character was sitting or interacting with complex lighting.
So they could graft Evans' face onto him.
Exactly. They would seamlessly graft Evans' facial performance onto Dini's physical frame.
4 takes just to get a guy to walk across the room. I mean, it is a staggering amount of effort just to prove that the character's humanity is what matters.
It is.
But it actually provides this perfect transition into the historical side of our sources. Because that painstaking physical transformation in the movie perfectly mirrors how the character was constructed in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't born a superhero.
No, he was built as a tool for a very specific cultural moment.
Right. And this is where the new historicism academic study comes in. The core argument of new historicism is that you simply cannot understand a piece of literature, or in this case, a comic book, without understanding the exact cultural anxieties of the time it was produced.
You really have to view these texts as cultural artifacts.
And there is no greater cultural artifact than Captain America issue #1. I mean, in 1941, creators Joe Simon and Jack Kirby introduced him, and they did not subtly ease into it.
Not at all.
They put him in a bright red, white, and blue suit and slapped a drawing of him punching Adolf Hitler square in the jaw right on the cover. But the wild part is the timeline. They published this before the United States had even entered World War II.
It's so crucial to understand how dangerous that was at the time. Hitler had been in power since 1933, and the atrocities were definitely becoming...
But that leaves a massive structural problem. What happens to a character built exclusively for World War II when World War II ends? Suddenly, the guy wearing the flag is walking around a country that is rapidly changing.
That initiates a fascinating, decades-long identity crisis. Because comic book narratives thrive on clear moral binaries, right? Good versus evil.
Sure.
When the 1950s rolled around, we entered the Cold War. And the writers tried to rebrand Captain America as a commie smasher.
Which feels like a bizarre pivot. You go from punching a dictator to what? Punching a political ideology?
That is exactly why it failed with readers. The paranoia of the 1950s was pervasive, but it was an ideological battle. The perceived enemy wasn't an invading army in uniform. It was the terrifying idea that your neighbor, your teacher, or your favorite actor might harbor communist sympathies.
And you can't punch a suspicion.
Exactly. It didn't translate to the kinetic, visual medium of comic books, so the character just faded away.
And then the 1960s and 70s hit, and America is embroiled in the Vietnam War. I would assume, given his history of fighting overseas, they would have sent him straight to the jungle. But they didn't, did they? Marvel essentially benched him.
Yeah, it was a purely demographic and business calculation. By the late 60s, comic book readers weren't just little kids anymore. They were college students facing the draft.
Oh, wow.
The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. Marvel realized that if Captain America supported the war, they would infuriate their growing anti-war collegiate readership. But if he opposed it, they would alienate the pro-war traditionalist readers. It was a no-win scenario.
So they just kept him stateside.
Yep. They focused inward, crafting storylines where the character struggled with severe alienation, grappling with the trauma of his past, and feeling utterly disconnected from the modern era. He basically had PTSD.
I mean, I understand the business logic, but it feels like a massive cop-out. Well, they avoid taking any stance on Vietnam to protect their sales, right? Yeah. But then, just a few years later, during the Watergate era, they suddenly decide it's perfectly fine to make the President of the United States the ultimate supervillain. That is some serious whiplash.
It is whiplash, but it actually reflects how rapidly public sentiment shifted. During Watergate, the existential dread wasn't coming from overseas, it was coming from inside the house. Trust in institutions absolutely plummeted. So the writers created a storyline where Captain America uncovers a vast fascist secret society trying to subvert the country.
And the acronym for this evil organization is literally CRIP,
Yes.
the Committee to Regain America's Principle. I mean, you cannot make this up. It's so painfully on the nose.
It is incredibly blunt. But it climaxes with Captain America breaking into the White House, only to discover that the leader of CRIP is the president. The comic doesn't show his face, but it heavily implies it's Richard Nixon. The realization that the government he serves is deeply corrupt shatters Steve Rogers so completely that he actually abandons the Captain American identity. He takes on a new, stateless persona called Nomad.
It's brilliant, honestly. He is this living cultural time capsule. He gets dug up every decade and is forced to reckon with whatever messy, complicated version of the country has emerged while he was asleep.
And that mechanism never stops. If we look closer to our own time in the post-9/11 era, the comics ran a massive storyline called Civil War. The government introduces the Superhuman Registration Act, which demands heroes reveal their identities and operate strictly as government agents.
Which is a very thinly veiled parallel to the Patriot Act and all the debates surrounding government surveillance.
Absolutely. And in this storyline, Captain America looks at this government overreach and decides to fight against it. He leads a rebellion against his own government, becoming the living symbol of the struggle between national security and personal civil liberties.
And what's crucial here, especially when you are consuming media today, is not whether the writers were politically correct or incorrect about surveillance or Vietnam. And just to be clear, we are strictly reporting on the comic's narrative choices here as historical reflections, not taking any political sides.
Of course.
But the fascinating part is how they used this character as a blank canvas to process exactly what the American public was stressing out about at any given moment. He is a barometer for national anxiety.
That is the perfect way to frame it. The narrative choices are direct reflections of historical tensions. The character is constantly forced to ask, what does it mean to be a patriot when the government you serve might be wrong?
Right. So we have 70 years of this incredibly dense, highly political, deeply contradictory history. You've got alternate timelines, kid sidekicks, presidents turning into villains.
It's a lot.
When you sit down to make a multi-million-dollar movie in 2011, how do you possibly distill all of that noise into a single, cohesive, cinematic story that general audience will actually buy into?
You have to act as an editor of mythology. The filmmaker succeeded by selectively blending the best, most grounded elements from different comic book universes.
Okay, break that down for us.
For decades, the main Marvel continuity was known as the 616 universe. But in the early 2000s, realizing their lore was getting way too tangled, Marvel created the Ultimate Universe, which was a modernized, grittier reboot. The 2011 film masterfully synthesized the history of 616 with the grounded realism of the Ultimate line.
The best example of this synthesis is Bucky Barnes. Because if you go back to the classic 1940s comics, Bucky was created for one specific reason. The publisher saw how much money Batman was making with his sidekick, Robin.
Naturally.
So they gave Captain America a literal teenager in a bright blue and yellow costume to crack jokes and lighten the mood while they fought Nazis.
But putting a child soldier on the front lines of a cinematic, gritty World War II movie would have immediately destroyed the careful, grounded tone Joe Johnston was building with Chris Evans. So they looked to the Ultimate Universe, where Bucky and Steve were the same age. The film then took it a step further. They made Sebastian Stan's Bucky a childhood friend who acts as an older brother, constantly protecting the skinny Steve Rogers from alleyway beatings before the serum.
It completely flips the dynamic.
Yeah.
But I have to wonder, when you streamline a character like Bucky, taking him from a goofy kid's sidekick and turning him into a serious, protective older brother, do you lose the DNA of the original comic? Or is it just necessary for modern audiences to take it seriously?
I'd argue it actually deepens the DNA. It gives Steve Rogers a profound personal tether to his humanity. When Steve tragically loses Bucky later in the film, it's not just a hero losing a sidekick, it's a man losing the very last piece of his life from before he was transformed.
Oh, that's heavy.
It raises the emotional stakes exponentially. And they applied the same careful synthesis to the main villain, the Red Skull.
Because the comic book origins of the Red Skull are utterly unfilmable.
They really are.
In the classic comics, Johann Schmidt is a bellhop working at a hotel. Hitler happens to be staying there, catches Schmidt looking angry, and basically decides, I can turn anyone into a master Nazi. and just hands him a terrifying mask.
And if you look at the Ultimate Universe, it gets even darker and stranger. In that reboot, the Red Skull is actually Steve Rogers' illegitimate son.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he's taken by the government to replicate the serum. The son goes rogue, rejects his father's legacy, and slices his own face off with a kitchen knife to look like a skull.
There is zero chance a Disney-distributed Marvel movie is putting a guy slicing his face off in a summer blockbuster.
Exactly. So the filmmakers found the perfect middle ground. They made Hugo Weaving's character the head of a rogue science division called Hydra. His face is deformed because, in his arrogance, he injected himself with an early, unstable version of the super soldier serum.
Which creates a brilliant thematic foil to Steve Rogers. The serum simply amplifies what is already inside. For Steve, it amplifies goodness and courage. For Schmidt, it amplifies megalomania and monstrosity.
Right. And to give him that unsettling intellectual gravity, Hugo Weaving famously based his vocal cadence on the eccentric German filmmaker Werner Herzog.
That attention to detail is just wild.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop at the script or the acting. They carried that thematic weight into the music, too. Our sources include this great interview with composer Alan Silvestri. He was brought onto the film with just 7.5 weeks before recording.
That is no time at all.
7.5 weeks to figure out the definitive sonic identity for a 70-year-old cultural icon.
But Silvestri is a seasoned veteran, and he immediately understood the strange contradiction of the film. It was a historical period piece wrapped inside a high-tech sci-fi environment.
So how did he handle it?
To bridge that gap, he leaned heavily into Copland-esque brass.
Oh, you're talking about Aaron Copland, the classical composer famous for that wide, sweeping Americana sound, like Fanfare for the Common Man.
Precisely. Silvestri knew those wide brass intervals evoke a sense of open spaces, grandeur, and earnest heroism. But practically speaking, he also needed instruments that could sonically punch through the massive sound effects of modern blockbusters, motorcycle chases, explosions, and laser blasts.
Right. Brass provides that necessary cut.
It does. But what truly shows his genius is how he approached scoring the Red Skull.
Right, he didn't write some goofy mustache-twirling cartoon villain music.
No, not at all. Silvestri scored the Red Skull as a deeply tortured being who had been cast out of humanity. He explicitly compared his musical approach to Darth Vader. He treated the villain with absolute seriousness and heavy emotional weight, recognizing that a complex, tragic villain ultimately gives the hero more dimension.
The level of care they put into the margins of this movie is amazing. They even managed to seamlessly weave in deeper comic lore, like Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos.
Oh, yeah.
You literally have Dum Dum Dugan right there on screen, wearing his ridiculous signature bowler hat. And they slyly nod to the comic lore that Nick Fury stays young because of an injection called the Infinity Formula. They don't stop the movie to explain it, they just let it exist, making the world feel incredibly lived in.
By meticulously grounding the character emotionally, visually, and musically, they earned the audience's trust. They proved he wasn't just a relic, which gave them the right to bring him out of the ice and into the modern cinematic universe.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. I think our sources definitively prove that there is so much more going on under the surface of these stories. We started with Chris Evans's intense reluctance to join the blockbuster machine, and saw how that led to a painstaking 4-take CGI process that physically proved his character's humanity.
And from there, we traced how that humanity was tested against the shifting tides of real-world history. We watched him evolve from a blunt World War II propaganda tool created by two young men trying to wake up America.
To a disillusioned nomad reacting to government corruption during Watergate.
Exactly. And finally into a rebel fighting for civil liberties in the post-9/11 era.
And it all required a brilliant act of cinematic editing to synthesize 70 years of convoluted, messy comic lore into one unified story. All anchored by Hugo Weaving's Werner Herzog impression and Alan Silvestri's soaring Americana brass.
Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought to consider for you listening at home.
Lay it on us.
We've spent this entire time talking about what this character means as an American cultural barometer. But if comic books are a cultural artifact and Captain America's ideals shift based on the era he wakes up in, what happens to a symbol of freedom when a society's very definition of freedom fractures?
Oh, that is a phenomenal point.
Right. If someone were to write the definitive Captain America comic for today's specific cultural moment, who would he be fighting? And maybe more importantly, what side of the cultural divide would he actually stand on?
It really makes you realize that the blockbuster movie you watch this weekend is probably processing some very specific cultural anxieties right under your nose. The next time you see a superhero punch a villain, ask yourself what real-world issue is actually taking the hit. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.